For the war in Crimea, all those felt uniforms that all the soldiers wore were made here at Smedley's factory. I'll show you where it is.
Did you say it was the oldest factory in the world?
The oldest still working factory in the world. They were very, very wealthy in the time. Yeah. Those two families, the Nightingales and the Smedleys, were very wealthy. But they were also benefactors. They were quite generous. Unusually for rich folk, I suppose. For some of them, they were benefactors. They built things for the community. But he did build, you're right, the hydro at Matlock.
So he came up from being an overseer in the factory to get that wealth.
That wealth. He built massive wealth. Yeah. Well, of course, the Crimean War and all these wars, money starts getting spent, doesn't it?
It does.
Over there you can see Crich Stand, very famous landmark. Can you see it on the skyline?
Yeah. Tower.
That was there was originally a stand there built for many years before, but in 1923 that was
by a stand.
Well, it was called a stand. It's a tower.
Just a tower.
Yes, it was built by the Sherwood Foresters in 1923 to commemorate soldiers killed in the Great War. It's built at 1,000 feet above sea level. It's 52 steps from bottom to top. Wonderful views of 8 counties from the top on a clear day. You can see the Humber Bridge, and you can see Lincoln Cathedral from the top of that tower on a clear day. Wow. But as you can see, it's got a good view. There. And Lee and Holloway here down on the right, which is where we're headed. A very famous supporter of Queen Mary of Scots, somebody who tried to help her when she was in captivity. Of course, as you know, she came to Buxton on a number of occasions. Was Anthony Babington, and because of his support for Mary Queen of Scots, after she was executed, he was taken and he was executed in the Tower of London in 1586 for treason, for supporting Mary Queen of Scots. He didn't. The Nightingales and the Smedleys, as well as this factory that they were involved in, they did mining around here and all sorts of things, because anybody who owned land, of course, made big money in those days because they started exploiting mineral resources. Steady, Jim.
Hang on to it.
Nearly collided.
Sorry about that.
All right, keep going.
Rod, keep going. All right, Tolly.
Clouds thickening up as well.
A very wealthy guy here who lived here at Lea Hurst, a house I'm going to show you shortly. It was William Nightingale. Before the dates I'm telling you about now, and he died, and in his will he left all his money to a relative called William Shaw, who lived in Florence. And William Shaw inherited all this wealth, this land, the house, Lea Hurst and everything else, on the condition he could have the money as long as he changed his name to Nightingale, to keep the Nightingale name going. So of course, like a shot, he did, as you would, wouldn't you? He was living in Florence at the time and had a daughter in Florence who would have been Florence Shaw but for this quirk of fate and the will. So of course she became Florence Nightingale. And Florence Nightingale, the Lady of the Lamp, is who I'm going to tell you all about.
Really?
This is her hometown.
Really?
Lea Hurst down here is where she spent most of her life.
Bloody hell.
And where she went from here to Crimea, and she came back to here from Crimea. And I can show you and I can catalogue exactly the path she took when she walked to Lea Hurst back from Crimea. And I'll tell you why I know it's exactly the steps that you're going to walk on.
Oh, extraordinary.
So this is
She
her
was
home.
born where? She was born in Florence.
She was born in Florence. And that's why she was called Florence. Well, she would have been Florence Shaw.
Yeah.
But she became Florence Nightingale.
Could be redwood, yeah.
They usually have a soft bark to them, don't they?
Yeah, so very soft bark. You're right.
Yeah. That's a big bugger.
She attended various chapels around here, and she wasn't too bothered about different denominations. She attended a number of different religious churches and wasn't. Of typhoid, and she became quite skilled in nursing people suffering from typhoid. And she also started going into hospitals, even though her parents bade her from doing so. Yep, and hospitals in those days were dreadful places, considered completely unsanitary. They had no care at night in those days, and she worked nights in some of these hospitals trying to care for people. And she became, as I say, expert in typhoid. She then went to London and worked in London hospitals, which must have been even more dire, and established for gentlewomen with illnesses. And the Crimean War was going on, and the Secretary of War, Sidney Herbert, hearing about the state of British hospitals in Crimea, sent for Florence Nightingale, and she recruited 38 nurses to take to Crimea. And they went and worked there, and she was instrumental in getting conditions improved. And the reason she became so famous, of course she was well known in this area, she started writing letters to the Times, describing exactly what was happening out there, particularly to British soldiers who were injured, the sickness, the disease, the injuries not being treated properly, the poor conditions in hospitals, and she became a cause celeb. People reading her letters every week in the Times, and she became very, very famous. She also established, and because of this fame and her parents' money, she started spending more money, and she established Thomas's Hospital in London, which is of course probably the most famous teaching hospital in the country. And former patients, because she'd been working in this hospital for gentlewomen, she started getting all sorts of donations from wealthy people. So what she did really created a massive movement in terms of better nursing. But this was her home. You'll see it much more closely in a minute. She got back, she arrived at Dover to find brass bands playing and a civic reception, the Mayor of Dover, and a mass banquet laid on for her. She was really quite embarrassed, didn't like any of this. And she went to the banquet and was feted by all sorts of people. Received invitations from royalty to go to, waiting for her when she landed at Dover were invitations to go to Buckingham Palace. But instead of that, she went to the banquet and decided to come home here. And this is the reason I'm telling you about walking in the footsteps of history, because she got on the train to come back to Matlock, and to come back to Matlock Bath, and word got to her that there were mass bands and thousands of people at Matlock Bath waiting to greet her, which she didn't like at all. So she jumped off the train at Wat Stanwell, and you walk from Wat Stanwell station about 200 metres to the canal where we're going, and you reach this path, and this is where she came. And
she walked up this path.
I'll tell you now, walk in the footsteps of history. You laughed about that, but she, the servants from this Lea Hurst came down and met her, and they walked up this path to Lea Hurst to home, and she dodged all the crowds. So she came home, and the Duchess of Devonshire, you mentioned the Duchess of Devonshire, Duke of Devonshire invited her to a reception at Chatsworth, and she didn't go to that. She preferred the limelight, but she'd done a job really. First woman ever to be invested into the Order of Merit. She died in 1910, aged 90, and was offered burial in Westminster Abbey, and she turned that down. She must have been told about it before her death. She was buried near the summer home. In March 2 years ago, after this was sold, some of the artefacts in this house were sold at an auction, And the auction, one of those was a candle lamp. And the auctioneer said it was an unadorned 25 centimetre tall lamp with wonderful provenance that can be traced to two sisters who'd been in service here at Lea Hurst in the 1850s and worked with Florence Nightingale. These are the sisters that go and meet Florence and met her at Watstanwell Station, so it was their lamp from their room. So there were still artefacts in this house from when Florence Nightingale died. This other wonderful books, very, very famous still. There's Elizabeth Gaskell Society in Manchester that worships the work she did. When Florence was in Crimea, she came here and wrote North and South here. And she came here for solitude because her publisher, this Elizabeth Gaskell, her publisher was Charles Dickens. He published books as well as writing them, and he was impatient for her to finish North and South. And she came here to finish it. And she wrote about being entranced from the view from the window of Florence's study there. She wrote, "First there's a garden with stone terraces, flights of steps and old stone columns with globes in front of them, you can just see them. Then a lovely sloping meadow, louving itself in a steep wooden descent to the River Derwent," and that's exactly where you're stood now. So, footsteps of history, gentlemen.
That sounds all right to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.